Hello, I'm James Carey, back again for the Armenians Speak series for Geopolitics Alert. Today's guest is Ara Sanjian of the Armenian Research Center at the University of Michigan Dearborn, who is currently focused on the Soviet period of Armenia and Artsakh. This interview was put together with help of my partner Julia on this project, although she does not appear in this session. But please enjoy our questions with Dr. Ara Sanjian and some historical background to the crisis in Artsakh currently. So let's start with our first question, which is, what is the significance of the region of Nagorno-Karabakh, and why is Azerbaijan so invested in retaking this region which is made up of mostly ethnic Armenians?
Oh, well, Armenian written records in history start from the 5th century CE, that is about 1600 years ago. Of course, but records in other languages mentioning the existence of Armenians there are at least from 2500 BCE. We have ancient Persian and ancient Greek sources, and after all, sources written in other languages of the various empires that went through. And we can say that at least from the time of recorded history, there is an Armenian presence in this region, which is now called, of course, Nagorno or Mountainous Karabakh. And it was part of a much larger province of historic Armenia that comes from a early medieval Armenian geography textbook written sometime between the 5th and the 7th centuries, because it has been edited a number of times. We cannot fix the exact date. And at that time, of course, it was part of one of the 15 provinces of historic Armenia, and Artsakh is one of those 15 provinces. Artsakh is a much larger territory, according to that geography, than the area of Nagorno-Karabakh, which was an autonomous region of Soviet Azerbaijan. Now, basically, when Armenian states lost their independence in that region, and that's basically from around the 11th century. From then on, the area, although still populated by Armenians, was part of various empires, from Mongols and then Tamerlane and then the Ottoman and the Safavids. And it was part of the Safavid Empire, Iranian Empire, from 1500 up until the early 1800s, when the Russians actually occupied the region. And part of Nagorno-Karabakh became Russian in 1813, smaller part became part of Russia in 1828. And then, of course, Armenians continued to live in that area as a majority population. But in the various territorial administrative divisions that the Russians introduced, and they changed those divisions a number of times, from 1828, let's say, when they had complete control over the area, up until 1917, when the Imperial Russian government collapsed because of the revolutions of 1917. In the last one of them, the territory of Nagorno-Karabakh was part of the governorate or province of Elizavetpol. That's the Russian name of modern city of Ganja in Azerbaijan. So when the Russian Empire disintegrated in 1918, three independent republics emerged in the Caucasus, in the South Caucasus, or in Transcaucasia, as the Russians called it. They were Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia. And they survived for about 12.5 years. So the last one to fall was, of course, Georgia in February 1921 to the Bolsheviks. So in that period, they could never agree, three of them, about their mutual borders. And Karabakh was also part of those bones of contention, in this case between Armenia and Azerbaijan. But there were also territorial disputes between Armenia and Georgia, and there were also territorial disputes with Azerbaijan and Georgia. The reason was that there were two different principles that each nationality was pushing forward according to the convenience of that argument for that specific plot of territory. Whenever they had the majority in a Russian province, like, for example, the Armenians had the majority in the Yerevan province, Azerbaijanis had the majority in the Baku and Elizavetpol provinces, the Georgians had majority in the Tbilisi or Tiflis and Kutaisi provinces, the ethnic majority demanded the whole of the territory. putting forward the economic argument that, since they were all part of the same province, economically, they were basically run from one important urban center, be that Yerevan, Elizabethpol, Baku, Tiflis, you name it. But however, none of these provinces were ethnically homogeneous. And if you go down one level down to the district level, yeah, there were districts where, for example, another nationality predominated, in a way, numerically. For example, there were districts in the Yerevan province where Muslims or Azerbaijanis were larger in number than the Armenians. And of course, there was the opposite in the Elizabethpol province as well. So technically, we're focusing only on Karabakh because that's the hotspot issue. In that case, the Azerbaijanis claimed Karabakh because it was part of Elizabethpol province, and the whole province had a Muslim, Turkic-speaking majority, which we call that group today Azerbaijanis. At that time, the name was still just beginning to be used. The Russians used to call them Tatars. But that's secondary, what they used to call themselves. And Armenians were, of course, saying, but no, but in this particular district, we are the dominant majority, and that is very close to Armenia or the province of Yerevan, and it has to be part of the Yerevan province. So essentially, when the two nations went to the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, both of them, made these rival claims. And the Sevres Treaty, which ended the World War I with the Ottoman Empire, never discussed this issue. It only said that the border between Armenia and Turkey will be this. It never mentioned what the borders between, Armenia and Georgia, Georgia and Azerbaijan and Armenia should be. Forget about that the Sevres was not implemented. By that time, already the Bolsheviks had come to dominate the region. And once they Sovietized Azerbaijan first, Armenia second, and Georgia third, and all that happened within the space of 1 year in 1920, 1921, then in the end, they had this duty of trying to draw the borders because, as you know, the Soviets wanted to set up a federal state. Initially, these were independent Soviet republics up until 1922, when, of course, they joined the Soviet Union and became union republics in a federal state. And in that sense, there were three areas that were disputed between Armenia and Azerbaijan. With Turkish pressure, Nakhichevan was made part of Azerbaijan. The Soviets agreed to leave the area between them, which is the Armenians called Zangezur, as part of Armenia. And as a compromise, they said that Nagorno-Karabakh should be part of Azerbaijan, but it should enjoy autonomous status. And that's why in 1921, the decision was made to grant Karabakh autonomy. In 1923, actually, the statutes of the autonomous region and its borders were actually decided upon by the Bolshevik government. So ultimately, Azerbaijan relies on this argument that it was part of Soviet Azerbaijan. And when the Soviet Union disintegrated in 1991, the international community automatically accepted the Soviet borders as to be the new international borders, without really much going into detail of how those borders had been fixed. Armenians have always said that this has been imposed on them, because in the end, the Bolsheviks were able to impose this kind of solution only because of Red Army's firepower. Yeah, some kind of Pax Sovietica, when a dominant center actually dictates on the weaker provinces, how they should live together. Based on this concept of Pax Romana, we can also use it as some kind of Pax Sovietica for that. And so Armenians had always been very unhappy about this, and probably we may talk about how they manifested unhappiness in the Soviet period in the next questions. But in the meantime, also, an Azerbaijani historiography has developed, largely for local consumption, because it rarely makes the international argument. It's very difficult for them to get peer-reviewed journals published on this issue. It's because I believe it's very weak. But at least in the local schools, education, in President Aliyev's interviews, you see that they consider themselves to be there from times immemorial and try to argue that Armenians in Karabakh moved there only after the Russian annexation of the region in 1928. That's, of course, using some kind of historical record and trying to fix it. I'm not going into details of why they do that, but that's the way they teach their history. And today, there's a whole generation of Azerbaijanis who sincerely believe, because they have been taught like that at school, it's part of their identity, yeah, that this land belongs to them from time immemorial. Now, how do you solve the whole question that the Azerbaijanis today are Muslims, while the Armenians are Christians? And in Karabakh, you have a lot of Christian churches, but historically there have been very few old mosques in the region. They have come to this idea that there was a nationality called the Albanians, not be confused with the Albanians of the Balkans, yeah, who actually we know very little about. Only a few pieces of their writing have been discovered, a handful of pieces, and we're talking about 1 or 2 manuscripts, 2 or 4 inscriptions. It has a very limited kind of use. But of course, there is a lot of information about the Albanians in Armenian sources. Now, in time, the Albanians, of course, lost as a single group, and some of them probably, got assimilated among the neighboring nations. So Azerbaijanis have come up with this idea that every Christian church was an Albanian church, so it belongs to them. And basically, they blame Armenian historians of, having actually distorted history and claiming this as an Albanian heritage as theirs. Again, this is an argument which will never actually pass through any kind of critical peer review. But that doesn't change much on the ground, when you have a big nation, much bigger in size than the Armenians, of course, in Armenia, actually have been taught and convinced of that. So for them, it's a question of territorial integrity. For the Armenians, it's the issue of the Armenians who have lived in Karabakh for many, many, many centuries, long before the Soviets drew these administrative borders, not necessarily taking the wishes of the local Armenian population into account. Yeah, and they don't think that this kind of an administrative decision by a government, outside government, should be today fetishized, sanctified, seen as the only way for the problem. The Armenian argument has always been that, Karabakh has never been part of any independent Azerbaijani state, willingly in that sense. So this is how things actually are at the moment. But as things go on at the moment, basically it's military force on the ground that is actually going to, at least until this moment, international intervention is very weak. Azerbaijanis are pushing for the issue of territorial integrity, while of course the Armenians stick to another principle, which is there enshrined in the Helsinki Final Act. And Armenia is in the OSCE area, so the Helsinki Final Act of 1975 does apply to Armenia and Azerbaijan as well, where self-determination of nations is also mentioned as a fundamental principle of solving problems. And in recent couple of years, they are also pushing forward the example of Kosovo, of what they call remedial secession. When the majority country, in that case Serbia, now Azerbaijan, are using brute force, to basically subjugate an insurgent minority, the only way you protect that minority's right to existence is what is called by remedial secession. That is to find such a formula where international community should recognize the region of Karabakh or Nagorno-Karabakh, as outside Azerbaijan's jurisdiction. What that may be probably is secondary. So because in this case, the idea is of course the secession. Now, there are some Armenians who say that the word secession should not be used here. It should be used recognition, because essentially what we have in Karabakh is an unrecognized state, which has been going on for 25 years. It holds elections, it has parliament, it has competitive politics, etc., etc. But the world does not notice it. International observers do not go to those elections. They don't see that kind of life, etc., because these kind of states do not exist on the map. And it's not the only case in the world. We have something like 10 similar hotspots all around the world where we have functioning mini states which are not recognized by various governments, or are recognized by extremely few protector governments, but not internationally. Even Kosovo has only been recognized by only half the membership of the UN and not all of it, although it has Western backing, but does not have Russian backing.
So as we get into the Soviet Union, what exactly led to the Soviets' decision to make Nagorno-Karabakh a autonomous oblast, and what powers exactly did that grant the region over the Azeri Soviet itself as the central government, seeing as Nagorno-Karabakh is in what's considered Azerbaijan, but was always given a separate level of autonomy by the Soviets? What exactly did that mean?
Okay, I think let me start first talk about Soviet federalism, which was gradually emerging when this decision was made in 1921, and finally actually turned into an official document in 1923. The Soviet system had this kind of four-tier kind of federal system where we have the central government at the top. You have the Union republics, which initially there were a handful of them. At one time it reached to 16, and then one of them was abolished. And by the time the Soviet Union disintegrated, there were 15 of them. And all those 15, of course, are today members of the UN, have been recognized as, independent states. Below them, there were so-called independent republics. Nakhichevan was one of them. And there were autonomous republics. And there were these autonomous regions, or as you use the Russian word, James, oblasts, yeah, which had even less roles. Now, there were others lower than that as well, but most of them were of lesser importance. So each of them had a certain level of autonomy. For example, autonomous republics had their own constitutions, which says that their territory cannot be changed without their consent. Autonomous oblasts did not have their own constitutions. They had their own internal regulations, statutes, and they did not have the right to decide on their own borders. And in the 70 years, for example, small changes on the boundaries of Karabakh have been introduced. So some villages have been attached, detached, etc., because that was within the right of the Azerbaijani Union government in that sense. So they had the right to use their own language, but they didn't have the right to have control over the content of their education. That was going to be approved by Baku. For example, when it came to teaching national history, Armenians in Karabakh could study national history in their own language, which is Armenian, but they had to study history of Azerbaijan, not history of Armenia. So in that sense, it made a difference. And over the which the Karabakh people have been unhappy with, I'm talking about the Armenians in Karabakh, is that the Azerbaijanis have used their prerogatives in order to lessen contact with Armenia. And that was a very major grievance in the 1980s. And even under Gorbachev, when this problem began, Gorbachev recognized that. For example, one of the few first reforms that he did is to put a relay station in Stepanakert so that it will be possible in Stepanakert to watch the Armenian Republican TV stations. So although the people in Karabakh and the people in Armenia use the same standard written Armenian language, of course there are differences of dialects, but we're not talking about education is in the standard written language. They could not watch Armenian television, for example. So these kind of things were there, and Armenians always had grievances that the Azerbaijanis are following such economic policies in the region so that the percentage population of the Azerbaijanis living inside the Nagorno-Karabakh Autonomous Oblast or Autonomous Region will increase. In the first Soviet census in 1926, there were less than 10% Azerbaijanis living in the autonomous region. But in the 1979 census, that percentage had risen to 22%. So in that sense, and especially under Heydar Aliyev, who is the father of the current president, who became the leader of Azerbaijan in 1969, Armenians were saying that policy has intensified. And actually today, people, when they praise Aliyev in Azerbaijan, they mention the fact that he increased the percentage of the Azerbaijanis in Karabakh as one of his political achievements to make him an appealing figure, to the Azerbaijani readership who is following the political discourse or reading history books. So in that case, the regulations were limited, but we cannot say they were zero. And in the sense that if you look at the Transcaucasus as a whole, there are three regions sorry, today, which refuse to be subject to the titular nationality. You have Abkhazia and South Ossetia disobeying the Georgian government, yeah, and having, of course, some kind of Russian protection. And you have the Nagorno-Karabakh disobeying Azerbaijan according to the Soviet principles, and of course having the protection of neighboring Armenia in that sense. These autonomous structures, limited as they were, allowed some kind of organization, which made it possible for them to organize and to articulate their grievances, etc. If we take Georgia, for example, the number of Armenians living in Georgia and the number of Azerbaijanis living in Georgia is much, much bigger than the number of Abkhazians or the number of the Ossetians living in Georgia. Armenians and Azerbaijanis also live respectively in compact areas, but they did not have any kind of autonomous status. Yeah. And so basically, they did not organize themselves in any way. So these structures, to some extent, were a Soviet invention, let's say, or some kind of method in order to solve the nationalities issues. But at the same time, when the overall Soviet project, of bringing the various nationalities closer together failed, they also became hotspots, when the local, smaller, nationality started expressing its grievances and tried to defend its own rights, using those Soviet era structures.
In the early years of the Soviet Union and the Turkish Republic, there was closer relations than there was later on in the Cold War. What role do you think this played in the establishment of the Nagorno-Karabakh region as a separate autonomous region? And what was Turkey's role in this decision as far as the Soviet Union was concerned? What were they considering about Turkey when they did this?
I believe the Soviets were forced to give Nakhichevan to Azerbaijan because of direct intervention by the government of Mustafa Kemal, which was not at that time internationally recognized yet, but it was the factual power on the ground, and it only became internationally recognized a couple of years later when the Allies, Britain and the others, agreed to negotiate with him and ultimately signed the Lausanne Treaty. The rest, I think it was, for me, keeping a balance. And in the end, they alienated the hardliners on both sides. Armenians were unhappy with the Bolsheviks, or the Russians, because the Russians were the dominant ethnic group within the Bolshevik party or in the Soviet Union, of giving Karabakh and Nakhichevan to the Azerbaijanis. Hardline Azerbaijanis blamed the Soviets for giving Zangezur to the Armenians. Because during that period from 1918 to 1921, both countries were actually claiming all these three territories at the same time. So that's my own thing. But on the other hand, there is so little factual information about how these decisions were made. At the moment, we have to come into guesses. Did, for example, Stalin's personality play a role in this? Armenians usually try to use that. There may be, but there is very little evidence. I can tell you if you want to why there is this idea of emphasizing Stalin in this issue. Although Stalin was not that dominant figure in 1921 yet, which he would become a few years later. Was it some kind of power politics? It's very, very difficult to say. But once they did, the Soviet government was always reluctant to change this. And every time Armenians expressed grievances, up until the time of Gorbachev, the Soviets were very reluctant to change borders. It's the same international concern that if we change borders here, other people will come up with grievances. Gorbachev said that if I actually exceeded Armenian demands, that this was back in 1988, there are 19 such cases across the Soviet Union. And today as well, I think most international diplomats will say, well, if we start changing borders, it will be a Pandora's box. But the problem is that a lot of minorities across the world are actually feeling the pressure of this, because it's also giving the titular majorities in various nationalist countries, actually to suppress local cultural identities for the sake of the unity of the nation. And in that sense, of course, Azerbaijan's attitude towards the Armenians in what is internationally accepted borders of is not different from in other cases. For example, the Kurds are a very good example, being under the rule of various Arab, Turkish, and Persian, Iranian governments, where, they have very limited rights because those governments fear the growth of any kind of vibrant Kurdish identity. So Karabakh can be also compared to those kind of things. And I'm sure there are issues like, for example, in Myanmar, we heard about that last year, when the Muslim minority was being persecuted by the government. Spain hasn't recognized Kosovo, and we need not tell you why it doesn't, so there are lots of other kind of things as well. So this issue of territorial integrity, which was at the heart of the Atlantic Charter of 1941, when Britain and America described their war aims, has been at the center of the UN Charter since 1945, but it is becoming extremely untenable in various parts of the world. So some kind of new international mechanism, I don't know what, has to be introduced in order to find a way out of how these kind of problems have to be solved, because there are many of them among the world. At the moment, Karabakh is the hotspot where such a struggle is actually occurring.
Now, Turkey has been stirring up a lot of conflicts with historic rivals such as Greece and their dispute over gas fields, with some view as Erdogan trying to uphold Turkish prestige even as his economy crumbles and foreign interventions fail. Do you think his very public involvement in Azerbaijan and supporting Azerbaijan is also part of this strategy of continuing to rely on historic Turkish grievances in order to motivate his base at home?
Erdogan is a very, very interesting personality. When he came to power in 2002, 2003, you know that his party won the elections. He could not serve in parliament, so they had some. So that's why we cannot exactly say when he came to power. But his party came in late 2002. Up until 2014, 2015, he had around him people, President Gül, Foreign Minister Davutoglu, and then Prime Minister Davutoglu, who basically had a more kind of diplomacy-oriented approach to politics. We now know. They have deserted him in the last 5 years or so, right, and they have become his critics. And so in the end, he opened up, benefiting a lot from the development of Turkish economy. I come from Lebanon originally, and I know how much the Turkish products, including pop culture, made inroads into the Arab world at the time. And there was some kind of an opening to the Armenians as well. It became relatively easier to talk about the Armenian genocide. The government started prosecuting people less on these issues. Books now could be published in Istanbul and could be sold at bookstores, something which was unimaginable, etc. And even in 2004, condolences. He did not condemn what happened, but that was a stage. In 2015, he allowed the Armenians in Istanbul for the first time to organize a requiem service for the victims of World War I without using the term genocide. And he even sent government representatives to attend that requiem service. So these were gradual steps. There was an attempt to improve relations between Armenia and Turkey in 2009, but it collapsed largely because of the policies of Karabakh rather than anything else, because Turkey wanted concessions from Armenia on the Karabakh issue, and the Armenians were not ready to give that concession. So in that sense, but at some point, he started changing. On the Armenian issue, the first thing which he did was to change the date of the annual Gallipoli commemoration to do it on the same day as the Armenian genocide commemoration, which was an unnecessary gimmick for me. But more than that, but still, as I said, on the same day, he allowed his minister to attend the requiem service. In 2014, we have at least 3 government documents signed by him or Davutoglu, where the word inhumane was used in Sanlıktaşı in Turkey to describe what had happened to the Armenians during World War I. That has the farthest that any Turkish government had ever come over those 100 years, to describe the tragedy of World War One. And then, of course, everything changed, as far as I am concerned, in the elections of 2015. What we call the British call the hung parliament, when no party got the majority in the parliament, and Erdogan had a choice to make coalition government with any of the three parties. That is the pro-Kurdish HDP, the nationalist MHP, or the traditional Kemalist CHP. Because his party, the AKP, the Justice and Development Party, was at the center, he would have made any of these choices, and that would have dictated policies. But what happened is that he chose the MHP, the nationalistic right. He started using violence against the Kurds. He started persecuting, those university professors who had called on him, to continue negotiations with the representatives of the Kurdish people in Turkey, etc. And then it started thinking that because of the American disengagement from the region, that there was a vacuum, and Turkey actually has to be very assertive. I liken him to a gambler who is putting a bet on a number of, or a stock buyer who is buying a number of stocks, hoping that some of them will give him money, and even if not all of them give them, the kind of benefit that he wants. So he has been active in Libya. He has been active in Syria. Turkey has always been active in northern Iraq. That starts from the times of Saddam Hussein. Then he sharpened relations with Greece and Cyprus again. They had been a little bit dormant over the years. Tried to come to Lebanon very strongly. Even after the explosion at the port of Beirut, they were there the next day offering, to actually run the port of Beirut, etc. And of course, now entering very strongly the conflict in the Caucasus, promising victory to one of the sides. During the earlier round of conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan between 92 and 94, the Turks, of course, were pro-Azerbaijani, but they were forced also calling for moderation. And in a way, that's a big difference. So ultimately, Erdogan's personality and his political choices are a lot beyond the turmoil in the Middle East. I'm not saying he's the only problem in the Middle East in general. Of course, we have other issues, but it's a new factor which was not there maybe some 10 years ago, but he has been very focused in going through these things. And now, of course, has brought Armenia into that issue by, for example, taking his mercenaries from Syria and Libya and take them to Azerbaijan, etc. Previously, the only one country which could have involved in both of them, Iran, had tried to keep these two issues very separate. The Iranians, they did not use the Caucasus problem in order to influence Middle Eastern politics or to bring Middle Eastern issues into the Caucasus politics. Turkey was doing roughly the same thing in the 1990s. Erdogan has changed the game, and we don't know what the repercussions of that game will be at the moment. Turkey seems to be in a strong position because of the collapse of any semblance of unity in the Arab world. I think that's the major issue here. But at the same time, he is making more and more enemies in the sense that we don't know when this balance will shift. Will he retreat, or will basically go on in some kind of a suicidal frontal attack to the extent that his NATO partners will openly also join in? For example, in this period, as I'm seeing it, of course, sitting here in Michigan, I don't know all the diplomatic details. I don't see he getting any kind of support from his NATO partners as far as the Karabakh conflict is going on. He's at odds with France. Americans seem to leave the Russians given a freer hand to deal with this issue. In all the statements by both the administration and Biden, there is no demand for Russia not to intervene, but there is a demand for Turkey not to intervene. But on the ground, of course, Turkey is very much involved. Russian sources say that some generals are involved. Azerbaijan is using Turkish weapons, and the Turkish television media is totally anti-Armenian. in its dealing of the conflict. And a couple of days ago, the vice president saying, if Azerbaijan asks for troops, we are ready to send troops as well, etc., etc. So in that sense, I think Erdogan's shift in his general Middle Eastern politics encouraged Haider Aliyev to seek a military solution to the conflict.
So, beyond motivations for Turkish involvement, I'd also like to discuss the timing of this current conflict in Artsakh. Turkey has been ramping up support for Azerbaijan over the last few years, but there was an exponential uptick in August, a month before hostilities broke out on September 27th. What do you think Ankara's logic is for this, and why is Turkey pursuing this conflict in Artsakh right now?
I think we have to see Azerbaijan and Turkey separately here. Azerbaijanis do consider Karabakh to be their own land, despite what the Armenians may claim. And so in their calculations, what the Armenians worry about does not feature in any sense. They need the territory, even at the expense of people not being there. And this war, even in the 1990s, was very vicious with its ethnic cleansing issues. Usually when armies went forward, and the borderline changed a number of times during the war of 91 to 94, usually all the civilians fled with them. And I expect that the Azerbaijani expectation is that if they defeat the Armenian defense lines, all Armenians from Karabakh will be fleeing. I don't think they're making any contingency measures of how to live with these peaceful Armenians once they actually occupy the area, if they can do that. That's why the Armenians are taking not any chances, and they're seeing this as some kind of a genocidal, that another wave of ethnic cleansing when they were pushed out of their lands, similar to World War I, when most Armenians were kicked out of their ancestral homes and villages, including my grandparents, of course, during World War I and after. In the case of Erdogan, I think it's more short-term measures. And Erdogan can change, but any Azerbaijani government cannot make a strong shift because that's a very important issue for them. But here it's Erdogan's, I think, and again, I'm not in his own mind, but I'm just trying to watch him, is that he thinks that nobody will pay attention, and by using force, he will get a lot, and that will be good also for his own image. Now, the economy is not what it used to be. I'm sure all these involvements in various parts of the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East and now the Caucasus are also adding to the government expenses. Even Davutoglu, a couple of weeks back, when he inaugurated his new party, considered that this person was a calamity and actually blamed him for allying himself with very radical fringe of Turkish politics, clearly defining what's the difference between these two Islamist leaders, that both of them may be Islamists, but they have very different visions of what the foreign policy of the Islamist Turkish government would be. So I think all of these are there, and it really depends on how long he will keep some Europeans hopeful that he may change. I think Greece is having that problem a lot with the European Union. It was among the 27 nations, 5 nations were against sanctions last week. But if Erdogan continues, it will be probably more and more difficult for his critics to give him, for those who give him the benefit of the doubt, to extend that period of grace for him. It all depends on how strong the Armenian defenses will be on the ground. Because if they achieve a quick victory, it will be a great thing. If they are bogged down in a long war, that will be bad, because it will be time for international pressure to build up on them when almost everybody is now aware that the war is continuing because Azerbaijan wants to continue with the war. With one thing is what to negotiate after the ceasefire. It's another thing whether to have a ceasefire now or not. These are two clearly different issues. So I think all these things are important. And yes, I believe personalities do matter in politics. Personally, a charismatic person like Erdogan, who enjoys a lot of support among the masses, But ultimately, there will be a cost for this. The price of the Turkish lira has been going down, yeah, and it is projected it will go down further. In a number of Arab countries, there are now boycotts of Turkish goods and products, etc. So all these things, and ultimately, Turkey's markets are mostly probably the Balkans. I don't know much about the Arab world, so you don't think that Turkey will replace its markets in the Arab world with new markets in the West. So all these are important factors.
I completely agree that Erdogan faces a crisis and his popularity is waning as the economy continues to sink, and even his nationalist partners in the MHP are losing vote share as well. And in a conflict like Syria, where the Turks have been able to use historical grievances with the Kurds to keep support for operations like Peace Spring and Olive Branch, those have remained a bit more popular due to, as I mentioned before, the historic grievances. Yet some of Erdogan's other projects, such as Libya or Qatar, while they have some implications of Ottoman history, don't seem as popular at home as, say, attacking the Kurds. Do you think this fight with the Armenians is something that Erdogan is reverting back to because he knows that'll have more widespread support than adventures in, say, as I mentioned, Libya or Qatar, rather than Greece or Armenia or Kurdish territory all across, southern Turkey and into northern Syria and Iraq?
Probably it's easier, to justify why you are fighting Armenians with the Azerbaijanis than saying why you are in Libya fighting with the UN recognized government against Haftar, or why you should be in Lebanon, for example. He has been using the Palestinian card, but I don't think anybody takes him very seriously on that. And if you are with the MHP, you have to play the ethnic card, because that's the forte of the nationalist movement party that, let's call it the pan-Turkist party in Turkey, which has been very active since the 1960s. And it has a much solid, even smaller, but much smaller voter base than the Just the Development Party. Just the Development Party may actually get divided into many parties once there is no Erdogan, but the Nationalist Movement Party, the MHP, has proven itself over the last 50, 60 years, as having a solid, small but a very solid electorate, which has maintained over this past few decades.
Now, Turkey has also been pumping all of their mercenaries from Syria into places like Libya and now Azerbaijan. So now that Turkey has loaded Azerbaijan with these extremists who really won't integrate into the culture there very well, seeing as they're not given the extrajudicial powers they're given in places like Syria or Libya, what do you think Turkey's long-term strategy is for their presence in majority Shia Azerbaijan, or do you think they'll just be packed up and sent somewhere else if this war fails? Or where do they go if they succeed?
I know some Arab nationalists will be unhappy with this comparison, but I liken Erdogan to Jamal Abdel Nasser. Jamal Abdel Nasser, in order to assert himself, used various ideologies in various parts of the world. Pan-Africanism, Pan-Arabism, international non-alignment, but in all of it, there was one important thing: to strengthen Egypt's position and, of course, equate himself with Egypt. Erdogan is basically the same in the sense that he's using various ideologies. He's going to the Arab world with the flag of Sunnism, yeah? He cannot use the same flag in Azerbaijan. So he is using the flag of language and culture. This idea that the Azerbaijanis have been our long friends, I really don't know how historically this is true. Is there any evidence before the 19th century, when linguistic nationalism comes into vogue, that, for example, when the Ottoman armies were fighting the Safavid armies, were the people living in Shirvan and Nuhi and these areas, which became Azerbaijan, very excited about the Ottoman advance into, let's say, Tabriz or whatever? I don't know, and I don't think so, but somebody has to study this. So he is actually trying to strengthen his own position as much as he can get because he believes in the greatness of Turkey. He equates himself with Turkey. He probably wants to be considered as important, if not important, than Ataturk. And 2023 is coming, 100th anniversary of the Republic, and how that will be commemorated. What will be the slogans to commemorate that? And when there will be some kind of renegotiations of the spheres of influence in the Arab East, from the area extending from Libya to Iraq, where Turkey wants to have its own share, together with Saudi Arabia, together with Israel, together with Iran, together with Egypt. So he is now taken as a player equal to them. And at least two of these countries, Egypt and Saudi Arabia, have taken a very strong stand against Turkey. Iran is trying to be more moderate. I see that in Lebanese politics, for example. Hezbollah does not criticize Turkey's involvement openly, but all the non-Shiite allies of Hezbollah do that very vehemently, which is some kind of a power game going on. So I think that he wants to go to the bargaining table with lots of chips in his own hand to be in a strong position. But at the time, because he believes in the use of violence, a lot of people are actually paying for that, starting from Libya to Syria, and now in the Karabakh region and the surrounding areas. So far, the Cypriot and the Greek side of it has not turned bloody, but we have to be very, very careful. It seems, again, I'm not in his own head, I'm just trying to read him from afar, but he sees that he believes in the use of force, to make changes. And that's why when we write his biography, we have to see how these two different Erdogans were. I remember in 2014 when he made the apology, the condemnation, I was asked to write on it, and it's available on the website, and I call it Too Little, Too Late. But I've said that a lot has changed under Erdogan. That is from 2012 to 2014. But we don't know whether he has been the motivator of that change or just has tried to live with something which is happening in Turkey because of other factors, more long-term changes that any society undergoes. Now it seems that he has tried to stop that and has given a lot of push toward the nationalist fringe. And I see that in the Armenian section as well. All those people who were very much active in those dialogue issues with the Turkish liberals in the past 10 years or so. And there have been many initiatives. I personally have not participated in any of them, but I have talked with many of those participants, both Turkish and Armenian. And I see that there are a lot of pressure now, because essentially one nationalism generates a counter-nationalism. And we are unfortunately in a very bad moment in the Caucasus when we have rise of nationalisms, and it will be years and years and years until we can bring the situation back into what it was. And this idea that Armenians and Azerbaijanis sooner or later have to come into an agreement, first and foremost because they're neighbors. Yeah, I don't know. That idea has been hit a lot by this war, and even myself, who probably are moderate, I think that we cannot think about this until this war is stopped. And even after the war is stopped, I really find it very, very difficult for some kind of a negotiated solution coming. And I don't want to talk about the situation in Azerbaijan, but I have a large network of friends in Armenia. I studied in Armenia for 5 years in the late Soviet period. I regularly visit the country. They are calling it a patriotic war. And there is not a single family who do not know somebody who was killed. Yeah. whether it's a neighbor, a relative, or whatever, etc. If we compare the sizes of the US and Armenia, in the US, 100,000 soldiers would have been killed in this past month. If we look at that, we don't know what is the number of casualties in Azerbaijan, because they are not giving numbers. But I believe it's heavy. And whatever the number of the mercenaries who have been brought from Syria, I believe the bulk of those who are being killed are Azerbaijanis. And like in Armenia, many of them are also conscript soldiers who basically did not choose to go to war, but they were doing their national duty, to serve in their national army when they are in this bloodbath that is going on. It's so sad to say that I hope that the casualties will push mothers to be an agent of compromise. In this sad moment, that's my only hope. As much as unlikely it is, as you know, every day we have so many young people killed, so many houses destroyed in Karabakh. The shelling is indiscriminate. Because it's a country which is not recognized, you don't have foreign diplomats recording what is happening. But in this sense, there is always hope that some solution will be there. Armenians will not hop on a balloon and go up. Azerbaijanis will not hop on a balloon and go up. They are bound to live together. And the only durable peace will be the peace based on compromise. Peace imposed by one side over the other just bury enmities. But I think it's too much to hope in these at this stage. At the moment, I think the war has to be stopped, and there is only one side which is continuing the war because it thinks it can war. Let's not play with this, let's be objective. Let's call it this and let's call that. That's it.
So that leads well into my last question, which I realize is going to be very broad and complex, so I apologize in advance. But what do you think will happen in the near future? Currently, Russia is the only state actor attempting peace negotiations via the Minsk process. Would you think Turkey would be more invested in as their relations with Russia have grown over the past few years? Although the Turks are on the opposite side of this conflict and the Libyan civil war, as well as in Syria, so that clearly complicates things. But with all this in mind, what do you see as perhaps the most likely way this conflict will come to an end? I don't see Azerbaijan retaking all of Nagorno-Karabakh. So what do you believe could be next?
This war will not stop until Azerbaijan feels that it has no stamina to continue. Now, will the Armenian force at some stage alone be able to put a line and beyond which it will be difficult for them to move? Or some other countries, Russia, and maybe some Western countries giving Russia a blank check saying, help Armenians to stop this? It's a possibility. Because I think on the other side, the appetite will grow if they move forward. And certainly, I will not take any chances. Personally, I don't think the Armenian government is giving them any benefit of the doubt. They haven't asked for my advice, but I would have told them, don't trust anything because here we have one person who wants to have glory. And okay, that's very understandable in a nationalistic context. I can explain that. But the other side, Turkey has a much different kind of expectations. It really depends on when Western words will turn into deeds. At some stage, they may. But actually, as things go, it's good that no declaration of ceasefire came out after Pompeo's discussions today, because it would have been just had the same fate as what happened with Lavrov and with the French intervention in the past couple of weeks. So that's the basic issue that I see in the short run. In the long term, as I said, the only way which will push the two governments for a compromise is the heavy toll. That suddenly they will have publics which will say, we don't want glory at the expense of so many young lives. Are we there?
Yeah.
I don't know about Azerbaijan. That's why I will not say anything. I really don't know what the population of Azerbaijan thinks. But I have always said that there should be a compromise. And in order to achieve a compromise, diplomats have to be extremely creative. To use a Christian term, the law is made for the man and not man for the law. Yeah. International law should be bent this way, that way, to save lives, to allow people to live peacefully and develop their own cultures the way they like. Sharing things should be encouraged rather than putting lines, exactly saying this is where you can do this and this is where you cannot do this. So at some stage, I think some kind of creative solution to the status of Nagorno-Karabakh has to be devised. And maybe encourage students or young scholars to come with ideas which will not fit into the traditional diplomatic definitions of territorial integrity and self-determination, but to have a very creative mixture of both. In the end, ordinary people will always find ways to live together as long as you provide them with the basics. The rest is problematic. So I hope that the war will stop. I hope that the war will not end in the sense that one side feels entirely victorious, because it's only then that we can have a solution. And as I said, the solution is durable if people go into it willingly, understanding that they are doing something positive, at least saving lives, yeah, by going into this. Victories and imposed victories will just delay a conflict which will erupt again by the aggrieved party anytime that aggrieved party will think that it can change the balance. But as I said, as things go now, pressure should be applied on one side because ultimately that side thinks it can win. And I don't know when that time will come. I'm not saying it will not come. I'm not sure I'm saying it will come, but I try to see that. The good thing is that traditionally the three countries which are involved in solving the problem in Karabakh, they have failed to do it, but at least they want to keep the same framework. And again, after Pompeo's meetings, the State Department press release a few hours ago basically reaffirms that same principles. But the problem is that in this case, Americans, French, and the Russians have to work together. American government officials have always told the Armenian community in America that this is one of the few problems where, despite all their other problems in between, the Russian and American foreign offices, State Department, and the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs have relatively close positions to one another. But as I said, in the next stage of negotiations, we have to break into new creative ideas because these two ideas have become fossilized and they will never be equated with one another unless we come up with different kind of a issue of a status. I don't know. But that's a must. That's a must.
Well, so special thanks once again to our guest, Ara Sanjian, Associate Professor of History and Director of the Armenian Research Center at University of Michigan Dearborn. This has been very informative, and once again, I am grateful for your time, and I know my partner Julia was too. So thank you again, and thank you all for watching.